Dear friends, I am Dr. Urmi Satyan from School of Liberal Studies, Pandit Deendayal Energy University. The topic that I have selected for today's lecture is Mac Flecknoe, a satire upon the true blue Protestant poet T.S. It is written by John Dryden, the father of English criticism. So as implied in the title itself, the poem in subject is a satire. It is also known as a mock heroic epic. Before we talk about the poem, let us first understand what is a satire and what is a mock heroic poem. Now, very interestingly friends, the relation between satire and mock heroic poem is quite interlinked. We can say that satire is a theme and mock heroic is a style. Satire is an objective and mock heroic is an instrument to carry out that objective, the purpose of satire. Nevertheless, we can draw a line of difference between them by saying that a satire is a harsh attack on a person in subject, whereas a mock heroic poem has a touch of humor with a scornful tongue to create a parody of a person in subject. Arthur Pollard says mock epic usually means that the author is in fairly good temper. We can understand this intertwining relation of satire and mock heroic by saying that every mock heroic poem is a satire, but every satire may not be a mock heroic poem. It can also be a mock heroic prose. For example, Jonathan Swift's The Battle of the Books is a mock heroic booklet that is written in prose allegory to deal with the conflict between the classical and the modern literature. When we explore the history of satire, we note that satire as a form of poetry is first invented by the Romans. The Roman classical writers like Horace and Juvenal flourished in writing satires. The form of satire was introduced to England by Sir Thomas Yatt in the 15th century. The full bright view of satire is seen in the Restoration as well as in the Neoclassical period. Restoration period is the period when monarchy was re-established, and Neoclassical period is the period of the revival of the ancient poetic style that existed during the time of the Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus. This was the time when the great ancient poets like Virgil, Horace and Ovid used to write poetry in a strict methodical way. And so, Neoclassical age is also known as the Augustan age. The most important feature of the Neoclassical poetry is that it follows the classical structure. We also know that Alexander Pope's poetry is written under the influence of the Horatian structure of metrical composition. So, when we compare the satire of the classical period with that of the Restoration and the Augustan period, we notice that it is only the structure, the method of writing poetry that is adopted. But in their subject matters, we see that the Restoration and the Augustan poetry is hugely different to that of the classical poetry. The classical poets of the 1st century had history, dignity, morality and national glory as their subject matters, whereas the Restoration and the Augustan age poets use the same form of poetry for personal and spiteful attacks on their contemporary poets. In Neoclassical period, the classical form of poetry is used for arguments and verbal wars. Alexander Pope says, truth, worth, wisdom, daily they decree, nothing is sacred now but villainy. Thus, satire is the dominant art, form, genre, or we can say a literary device that is used by the poets of the Restoration as well as the Augustan age. Now, let us briefly understand what is a satire. In the preface to The Battle of the Books, Jonathan Swift writes, Satire is a sort of glass wherein beholders do generally discover everybody's face but their own, which is the chief reason for that kind of reception it meets in the world, and that so very few are offended with it. Dr. Johnson defines satire as a poem in which wickedness or folly is censored. Dryden says the true end of satire is the amendment of vices, and Defoe says the end purpose of satire is reformation. Thus, a satirist not only attacks the rival but also performs a moral and a social duty. So friends, having briefly studied the origin and function of satire, let us study Mac Flecknoe, a satire as well as a mock heroic poem that is written by John Dryden, the poet laureate and historiographer royal in the court of Charles II. The objective of writing this heroic poem is to take revenge of some personal insults. The matter of fact is that Dryden's fame and prosperity made some of his rivals jealous of him. One of them was the Duke of Buckingham, who produced a play, The Rehearsal, to make fun of Dryden. Dryden took revenge of his insult by writing a political satire named Absalom and Achitophel. In this satire, Dryden satirizes not only the Duke of Buckingham but also Shaftesbury and Monmouth, who have also made attempts to humiliate Dryden. Again in 1682, Dryden wrote The Medal and vehemently satirized Shaftesbury as a crooked soul and a serpentine in arts. Immediately after publishing The Medal, Dryden writes Mac Flecknoe in 1684. Here Dryden takes Thomas Shadwell to task and addresses him as Mac Flecknoe, which means a son of Richard Flecknoe. Now, our pertinent question is, who is Richard Flecknoe? So, Richard Flecknoe is believed to be a worthless poet from Ireland. Dryden intends to insult Shadwell by calling him as the son of Richard Flecknoe and thus a natural claimant of Flecknoe's dullness and foolery. We should also remember that Dryden and Thomas Shadwell were political rivals. Dryden was a Tory, a party of the Royals, and Shadwell was a Whig, a party of the Republicans. Thus, Shadwell incurs Dryden's wrath also because of their political differences. In Mac Flecknoe, Dryden uses an epic event, an imaginary coronation of Thomas Shadwell as an heir of Richard Flecknoe, the king of dullness. It is from the very title that Dryden makes it clear that his poem is a satirical attack on the true blue Protestant poet T.S. Here, T.S. stands for Thomas Shadwell. It is said in many history books that Shadwell considered himself as the follower of Ben Jonson, and this was inappropriate in the eyes of Dryden, who believes that Shadwell's subject matters were not originally his own and were rather stolen from other legendary works. Dryden writes, "Nor let false friends seduce thy mind to fame by arrogating Jonson's hostile name, nor let thy mountain belly make pretence of likeness. Thine is a tympany of sense." This is a personal attack on Shadwell, whom Dryden deflates by saying that he should not claim for any poetic greatness just because he has as fat a belly as that of Jonson's. Dryden compares Shadwell's poetic sense to nothing but a tympany, that is a tumor, a kind of swelling. Thus, there were personal and professional reasons for resentment between Shadwell and Dryden. In addition, their affiliation with different political parties was also a point of contention for them. It is from the very outset of Mac Flecknoe, Dryden targets Shadwell for his arrogance and dullness. Dryden takes a reference of Richard Flecknoe, who is an incompetent and licentious poetaster who had many illegal children. Dryden says that Shadwell is equally incompetent, and so he deserves to be coronated as the legal heir of Richard Flecknoe. The opening lines of the poem say, "All human things are subject to decay, and when fate summons, monarchs must obey." Dryden is philosophical here by saying that fate is the only powerful element, and when it summons, every mortal person, whether a monarch or a human thing, must wither, must die. Immediately after this, Dryden calls Shadwell as an aged prince who flourishes in peace and who is blessed with issue of a large increase. All these describing features show how severely Dryden ridicules Shadwell. There is one more point of discussion that we must notice, and that is the use of the initials T.S. in the title. Dryden remains politically correct and safe by not giving Thomas Shadwell's full name and by using the most befitting adjectives, the true blue Protestant and the initial T.S. in the title of the poem. When Dryden says that it is a satire upon a true blue Protestant poet, he highlights the fact of the blue flag of the Republicans, that is of the Whigs. Also, during the poem, Dryden uses the first two letters T.S. followed by a dash to refer to Shadwell. These strategies are employed to safeguard himself from any legal notice. He makes Richard Flecknoe speak, "Sure, alone my perfect image bears, mature in dullness from his tender years. Sure, alone of all my sons, as he who stands confirmed in full stupidity." Here, Dryden presents one more example of his political smartness by making Richard Flecknoe as the proud father who dearly and loudly announces Shadwell to be the authorized claimant of his legacy of stupidity. Later in the poem, Dryden creates an imaginary conversation between the father, Richard Flecknoe, and his son, Mac Flecknoe, that is Shadwell. In this conversation, Richard Flecknoe advises his imaginary son, Shadwell, to rely on his own natural dullness and not to learn anything from any alien poet. Dryden writes, "But let no alien sadly interpose, to lard with wit thy hungry Epsom prose." Here, Dryden refers to Shadwell's play Epsom Wells and Sir Charles Sedley, who was an acclaimed poet of the time and who had written prologue to Epsom Wells. Dryden points out that it is not the wit of Shadwell, but the prologue of Sedley that fetches success to Shadwell, and thus Dryden satirizes Shadwell for not being genuine in his writings. From these lines, it seems that the ill practice of borrowing and using the fame of other successful writers was a common practice during the Restoration age. We can study this Shadwell-Sedley case in the light of what Alexander Pope says in his poem An Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. Pope writes, "There are many who come to me for my friendship and a prologue and £10. Dear friends, Mac Flecknoe is a poem that is replete with many personal references, personal attacks, and the history of the time. It can be an interesting topic for research to study the connection between English satire and the history of the time." Arthur Pollard writes in his book, "Satire is essentially a social mode. It has nothing in it of the transcendental. Satire does not exalt, it deflates." Dryden subtly uses the tone of epic with but slight adulteration to achieve many of his effects. With this, however, he mingles elements of downright deflation. The action of the poem is slight, but it gives Dryden scope to introduce and pillory most of the bad writers of his time. Charles Lamb says that Dryden claims a place among the worthies of this period, not so much for any transcendent genius in himself, as that he was the last of a great race, all of whom spoke nearly the same language and had a set of moral feelings and notions in common. A new language and quite a new turn of tragic and comic interest came in with the Restoration. In his essay on satire, Dryden himself says that it is easy to wittily call a rogue and a villain as the same, but it is hard to make a man appear a fool, a blockhead, or a knave without using any of those opprobrious terms. This is the mystery of that noble trade. Neither is it true that this fineness of raillery is offensive. A witty man is tickled while he is hurt in this manner, and a fool feels it not. Dear friends, Mac Flecknoe breams with personal, political, and also historical references. It is imperative to read it kaleidoscopically for a full comprehensive understanding. So, please read this mock epic poem patiently and closely to understand the age of Restoration and the satire written during this period. So, that is it for today. Keep reading, keep growing. Bye for now.